I had spent a year planning my wedding, ensuring every detail was perfect. We chose our date carefully, picked a gorgeous venue, and put down deposits we couldn't afford to lose. But from the moment I told my parents the plan, they started griping about my older brother's busy schedule. Apparently, he had an overseas trip that conflicted with our chosen date. Instead of accepting that he might just have to miss this one event, my parents decided everything should revolve around him. It was beyond frustrating, but I tried to be understanding, at least at first. They called me up one evening telling me they had a solution. If I postponed the wedding by 4 weeks, my brother could attend. Their reasoning seemed to ignore everything I'd already booked: caterers, florists, and even the officiant. Postponing might mean losing the date slot at the venue I'd fallen in love with. But every protest I voiced was met with, "We can figure that out, don't worry." I sensed they assumed I'd just bend. For years, I'd been the nice child, the one who always made sacrifices whenever my brother's schedule took precedence. But this time, I refused. My refusal set off a chain reaction I never saw coming. My mom was appalled and insisted I was being selfish. My dad started ranting about family unity, reminding me how important it was for my brother to be there. When I brought up the contracts I'd signed, they waved it off as if I could just pay a fee and reschedule. Nobody cared about what that would cost me. My fiancé tried to mediate, but they didn't respect him enough to listen. As far as they were concerned, I was the ungrateful child who wouldn't accommodate the golden boy. My brother texted me a sentence: "You should just change the date. It's not that big a deal." That was all he had to say about my year of planning. He had known for months that I was getting married on that date, but never bothered to mention his travel arrangement until everything was locked in. Now he was outraged that I wouldn't bend to his convenience. I was livid, but I tried to keep the peace. Maybe if I explained the penalties for changing the date, he'd understand. Instead, he shrugged it off as if money grew on trees. Things escalated when my mom decided to hold a family meeting at her house. My fiancé and I arrived, hoping we could work something out. The second we walked in, my parents and brother bombarded me with reasons I was being unreasonable. They insisted he was my only sibling and that I should cherish having him present on my special day. I stood firm and pointed out that we'd already mailed save the dates. People had arranged time off. My fiancé's grandmother was flying in from out of state. Changing everything just to suit my brother was disrespectful to every other guest. That's when my brother started mocking me for being too cheap to pay rescheduling fees. He rolled his eyes and made snide remarks about how I was always tight with money. My parents didn't defend me, they actually nodded in agreement with him. It was painfully clear they valued his presence more than they valued my feelings or the logistics of my wedding. I was crushed, but I refused to show it. I calmly told them the date stood, and if my brother couldn't make it, I'd still proceed. That was the moment my mother stood up and declared war. From that day on, my mother started calling relatives and telling them I was refusing to include my brother in the wedding. She twisted the story so I looked like a brat who wouldn't accommodate changes. Suddenly, I was getting texts and calls from aunts, uncles, and even cousins, all telling me I was being selfish. They said they'd heard I was excluding my brother on purpose, that I was turning my back on family. None of them bothered to hear my side. They assumed my mom's version was the truth. My dad stayed silent, fully complicit in her lies. I tried defending myself, but everyone just parroted my mother's lines. My fiancé told me to block them for my peace of mind. I was tempted, but part of me felt compelled to at least try explaining. I wrote a text detailing how I wasn't excluding my brother. He simply couldn't attend due to his own plans. When I hit send, I hoped people would finally understand. Instead, it fueled more drama. Some said I should have planned around his schedule from the start, that it was my fault for ignoring how important it was for him to be there. Amid this chaos, my fiancé and I tried to finalize the wedding details. We agreed we wouldn't be changing anything. The rest of my friends were supportive. His side of the family was also on board, but my side kept escalating. Soon, cousins started saying they might skip if my brother wasn't going to be there. I'd grown up with these people, always attending their birthdays, baby showers, and graduations. Now they were threatening to boycott my wedding because my brother's itinerary mattered more. It hurt deeply, but I dug in my heels. I wouldn't budge, no matter their ultimatums. Then came the day my parents called my fiancé behind my back. They tried convincing him to sway me. They accused me of disrespecting them and of stirring tension in the family. He told them he stood by me and that we were not moving the wedding date. Furious, my mother told him if I wouldn't respect their wishes, they might not help with any expenses we hadn't covered yet. We hadn't expected them to pay for much, but they'd promised to handle the rehearsal dinner. Now that was in jeopardy. My fiancé calmly said we'd manage ourselves, he reassured. After that, my parents stopped speaking to me directly. If they had anything to say, they'd say it through other relatives. I received passive-aggressive voicemails from my grandma claiming she was disappointed in me. My uncle wrote me a scathing email demanding I apologize to my parents. All this because I wouldn't cave to my brother's schedule. I started to wonder if I was crazy. Was I being stubborn? My fiancé reminded me that our date was set before my brother booked his trip. I hadn't done anything wrong. He urged me to stand my ground, and I intended to. As the wedding date neared, the tension only grew. My brother posted on social media about how sad it was that family loyalty meant nothing these days. He never mentioned me by name, but everyone knew exactly who he was talking about. My parents liked his post and commented with heart emojis. Meanwhile, every time I tried to talk to them, they found excuses not to engage. It felt like I was an outcast in my own family. I tried focusing on the exciting parts of wedding planning, choosing our music, writing vows, but their drama loomed over everything like a cloud. About 2 weeks before the wedding, my parents sent me an ultimatum. If I didn't change the date, they would boycott. They said my brother deserved to be there, and that a family wedding without him was pointless. I was stunned. I hadn't realized they were willing to go this far. My fiancé urged me not to cave, and I agreed. This was our day, and we weren't going to let them dictate our choices. When I messaged my parents to let them know we'd proceed, my mother replied, "Then don't expect us to show up." My father said nothing. On the day of the wedding, I wasn't surprised that my parents and brother were no-shows. I had a fleeting pang of sadness, but I pushed it aside. My fiancé and I married in front of true friends and supportive relatives from his side. Despite everything, the ceremony was beautiful. Our friends formed a protective cocoon of love around us. We laughed, danced, and cherished every moment. I refused to let my family's absence sour the day. After the reception, we left for our honeymoon feeling relieved. We'd done it on our terms, and that was so truly worth celebrating. We returned from our honeymoon to a barrage of voicemails. My mother declared that I was completely heartless for going through with the wedding without them. She said I'd embarrassed the family. My father's messages were mostly silence, followed by sighs, as if I owed him an apology. My brother posted a rant accusing me of purposely choosing a date to exclude him. None of them acknowledged their own part in missing the wedding. I listened to each message with a kind of detached disbelief. I'd made my choice, and it was time to move forward without their toxic influence. Initially, I had no plans for revenge. I thought distancing myself was enough. But then I learned from a cousin that my parents were telling everyone I'd demanded money from them, used it to pay for the wedding, and then banned them from attending. They painted me as a greedy ingrate who only cared about money. That was a lie. They'd never given me a dime for the wedding, yet some relatives actually believed them. I'd had enough of their slander. I decided if they wanted to wage war on my reputation, I'd be absolutely ready to deliver a counterstrike. I gathered all the receipts related to the wedding, vendor contracts, emails confirming payments, everything. I compiled screenshots of text messages from my parents and brother that showed their refusal to attend unless I changed the date. I also had messages from them threatening not to pay for anything if I didn't comply. Then I wrote a worded post on social media addressing the rumors. I attached the evidence, ensuring it was clear that I'd never received a cent from them and they had willingly chosen not to come. I avoided insults, but I let the facts speak for themselves. The backlash was immediate. Some relatives apologized for believing my parents. Others were furious they'd been lied to. My parents tried to claim I was faking the screenshots, but nobody bought it. My father tried calling me, demanding I delete the post because it was ruining their good name. I refused. I told him if he and my mother didn't want their lies exposed, they shouldn't have spread them. My brother stayed eerily silent on social media. I suspected he realized he'd look foolish if he continued attacking me. My post remained up, and I felt a sense of vindication. I wish I could say that ended the feud, but my parents doubled down in private. They left messages insisting I'd ruined our family, calling me ungrateful. I stood firm and refused to respond. I no longer cared about their attempts to guilt me. They could live with the consequences of their actions. My real concern was that the stress might affect my marriage, but my spouse was supportive, reminding me every day that we'd done nothing wrong. We focused on building our life together, staying away from the toxicity my parents brought. It felt freeing to cut them out. Months passed, and I embraced my new normal. Then I learned my brother was engaged. My parents reached out for the first time in ages, claiming they wanted to mend fences. They invited me and my spouse to my brother's engagement party, saying it was time to put the past behind us. I was skeptical. My father claimed this was a start, but I smelled manipulation. Still, part of me was curious to see if they'd changed. My spouse was less forgiving, but supported the decision I made. We decided to attend, if only to see how things would go. We arrived at the engagement party to find my parents acting as if nothing had happened. My mother hugged me stiffly and asked me to be nice. My father pretended I'd never exposed their lies. My brother offered a greeting. His fiancée seemed pleasant enough, but it was awkward. Then, in front of some relatives, my mother started talking about how happy she was that the family was finally back together. I noticed sideways glances as if people were testing my reaction. I forced a polite smile. My spouse stayed close, anticipating more nonsense. It didn't take long to unfold. My mother cornered me near the refreshments. She said my brother's wedding date would likely be set around his travel schedule and hoped I wouldn't cause problems again. Her tone dripped with condescension. I felt the anger boiling. She acted as if I were some villain who'd caused turmoil last time. When I calmly reminded her that I'd only refused to move my date because of their demands, she waved it away. She said, "Well, let's not rehash old drama." It was obvious she wanted me to fall in line this time. I had zero intention of granting her that satisfaction. I said nothing more at the party, but I really knew I wasn't going to let them walk all over me again. That night, my brother's fiancée messaged me. She explained they would pick a date soon, and she hoped I'd be part of the wedding. She seemed sincere, so I told her I'd attend if they didn't try to force me to change my life around them. She promised there would be no drama. That promise didn't last. Within days, my mother called me, insisting I help plan the event and chip in because family should come together now. I declined, politely but firmly. My mother blew up, accusing me of sabotaging my brother's happiness. She claimed I owed them support after refusing to reschedule my own wedding. I reminded her that they hadn't bothered attending. She threatened to tell everyone I was destroying my brother's marriage before it even began. That was my final straw. I blocked her number. I refused to feed into their games any longer. If they wanted help, they could hire a professional planner. I was done playing scapegoat. My spouse backed me up entirely, and together we braced ourselves for the inevitable fallout. I expected them to slander me again, and they did, but this time, I had no intention of letting it slide. Whenever a relative brought up my mother's claims, I calmly reminded them that my parents had disowned me over a wedding date, skipped everything, and then lied about it. I also explained how they now demanded contributions for my brother's wedding, even after they spent months trying to ruin mine. Most people backed off. Some even apologized. My brother tried to stay neutral, but his silence was telling. He never defended me, which confirmed whose side he was on. When the invitations for my brother's wedding went out, I received one. It seemed formal enough, with no special notes attached. However, I noticed the date was set during a time when my spouse had a major work commitment. It was almost as if they wanted me to choose between attending alone or not coming at all. I decided I wouldn't go. My brother never bothered to check my availability, and I saw no reason to inconvenience my spouse. My parents called once more to guilt me, but I ignored their messages. I was finally done playing by their rules. On the day of my brother's wedding, my spouse and I went out for a relaxed brunch instead. I felt a twinge of regret, but then I remembered every nasty thing they'd done. I owed them nothing, especially not forgiveness or compliance. Later, I heard from distant relatives that my parents were outraged I hadn't shown. They called me ungrateful and petty. I shrugged it off. They'd forced my hand long ago. If they expected me to just roll over every time, they clearly hadn't learned a thing. My decision to skip was my message. I wouldn't be bullied anymore. In the months since, I have maintained low contact. My parents have attempted to rope me back in with guilt trips, but I stand firm. My father sent me a letter urging reconciliation, claiming they never meant to hurt me. My mother occasionally texts me links to family holiday gatherings, expecting me to show up like nothing happened. I ignore them completely. My brother tried once to reach out and talk, but he didn't apologize for his role in the chaos. He just wanted to brush it aside. I refused entirely. Without genuine remorse, there can be no rebuilding of trust. I'm sharing this because I know people will ask if I've considered forgiveness. My answer is no. Forgiveness would require honesty, remorse, and genuine effort to repair the damage they caused. None of that has happened. I find peace in living my life without their demands. It's not easy, but it's less stressful than trying to please people who never valued me. Sometimes you have to let go of those who refuse to respect your boundaries. My wedding and the aftermath taught me that family can betray you just as deeply as any stranger. I choose self-preservation over blind loyalty. So that's my story. I stood my ground, refused to reschedule my wedding, and exacted my ultimate revenge by exposing their lies. Even now, they try to manipulate me back into the fold, but I won't give in. I've learned that being blood-related doesn't give anyone the right to trample your boundaries. The best revenge is living well, true to yourself. I don't regret a thing. My wedding happened on my terms. They missed out because they were too busy putting my brother on a pedestal. I hope they enjoy his spotlight because they'll never be in mine at all.